when Hurricane Sandy hit, CHPC was also affected. Our offices in Lower Manhattan were closed for a week because of the loss of power, and believe it or not, we're still without Verizon service. And while we did not suffer any dramatic losses, it did make planning for this luncheon quite challenging. When we were able to convene a meeting of our luncheon committee, it was clear that Joe Lhota was the unanimous choice for our Roger Starr Public Service Award, not just for his long career in public service, but most especially for his outstanding leadership of the MTA during the most devastating natural disaster our city had ever suffered. Working with his experienced team at the MTA, the system was shut down early, and perhaps more important, critical equipment was moved to high ground and protected. While the system certainly suffered damage in the unprecedented flooding, it was spared the devastation of transit systems in other places. Those of you from New Jersey know what I'm talking about. Joe protected our mass transit infrastructure, and buses would return quickly. As power returned that Friday, subway service on some lines were running again on Saturday. The New York Times wrote that the return of the subway was, quote unquote, on the verge of magic. Joe maintained clear communication with the public, understanding all too well how much the life of the city depends on our transit system. Joe's management of the MTA reflects his long experience in government and the private sector. Whether as budget director for the City of New York, as deputy mayor for operations, or commissioner of finance, Joe has maintained an open mind and a clear focus on the goal at hand. But I also know Joe as a competitor. He was director of public finance for First Boston and managing director of the Municipal Securities Group for Payne Weber Incorporated. Joe has an extensive affordable housing finance resume. He helped to establish and underwrite transactions for state housing finance agencies across the country. He was a lead banker to an impressive list of housing finance agencies, including the states of Connecticut, Massachusetts, and our own New York State Housing Finance Agency and State of New York Mortgage Agency, Sonny Mae. To this day, the clients Joe helped establish and nurture remain the backbone of affordable housing finance throughout the nation. The early wealth-building transactions that Joe helped initiate are the reason that housing finance agencies were able to withstand the strains of our recent economic difficulties. Aside from me, Joe is the best municipal banker I know. On behalf of the Board of Directors of CHPC, I'm very pleased to present the Roger Starr Public Service Award to Joe Lhota. Having forgotten the award, Joe brought it for me to present to him.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Marvin. Yep. Appreciate it. Thank you, Marvin, very, very much. And thank you, Geraldine, and everyone at Citizens Housing and Planning Council for presenting me with the Roger Starr Public Service Award. I'm honored to be this year's recipient. But before I start, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Sandy and one thing that you can do for the Transit Authority, who, by the way, I get a lot of credit for what happened and I deserve none. The men and women of the New York City Transit Authority, those folks who make the subways and the buses run, not necessarily always on time, but they always run. Next time you see one, go up to them and say thank you. Thank you for everything that you've done, because of their love of the city and the love of their job, they were positioned in places all throughout the system, throughout the entire storm, to make sure that all of the citizens of New York could be able to use the transit system, be mobile again, go back to work, and get their lives back to normal. So when you see any of the workers at the Transit Authority, say hello to them and say hello to them for me. So last week, I asked Geraldine and Richard Roberts, who is this guy Roger Starr for whom I'm getting this award? Roger Starr was, Geraldine gave gushing praise of Roger Starr. She called him a housing and planning intellectual and mentioned that he was the executive director of CHPC from the late 1950s until Mayor Beam appointed him the housing commissioner, to be the housing commissioner. And he was also, according to Geraldine, the mastermind of something called planned shrinkage. I didn't want to seem like I didn't know what she was talking about, so I didn't ask her what planned shrinkage is. So Geraldine, Richard, and I went on to discuss current and future housing policies in New York City. First thing I did when I got off the phone was to Google Roger Starr, find out who exactly this guy is, and I realized that he had passed away, but his obituary was the first thing that popped up in Google from the New York Times. And as you all know, if you ever want to know anything about anybody who's passed away, read the obit in the New York Times. So let me read to you a couple of things that the New York Times said in the obituary. Quote, Roger Starr, outspoken thinker on public affairs, who blended a lifetime of intellectual analysis with hands-on public service, and whose often provocative vision of his native New York City influenced public policy debates for decades. So I said, hey, this guy sounds pretty good. So I kept reading. Although Mr. Starr's beliefs were passionate, they were always a work in progress. From his Trotskyite days, he evolved into a New Dealer dedicated to slum clearance, public housing, urban renewal, in the Robert Moses mold. Now I'm really intrigued. How is it that I didn't know anything about Roger Starr? Times continued. Although Mr. Starr's beliefs became disillusioned when he viewed the flawed execution of good intentions, he adopted a neoconservative point of view, extolling the free market and tough love code of social morality and individual responsibility. Kind of sounded like me. So then, one day in 1976, while he was Mayor Beam's housing commissioner, he developed a proposal and made a speech, and he described what planned shrinkage is. And then all holy hell broke loose. Citing New York's declining population, lost jobs, social problems, high taxes, and stressed services, he urged the city to abandon depressed places like the South Bronx or East New York for any future development. Now I'm starting to wonder why I was receiving the Roger Starr Award. Well, after he did that speech, a furor erupted. His own mayor disavowed him. City council members called him inhumane, racist, and genocidal. Protesters disrupted all of his public appearances. Well, as you would imagine, he didn't last too much longer as the housing commissioner, but surprisingly, he joined the editorial board of the New York Times. Now I'm even more intrigued. I always knew there was a Trotskyite fervor at the Gray Old Ladies editorial board, but a neocon? Didn't know how that was ever possible. He also taught at the City University, and in 1985, he wrote a book called The Rise and the Fall of New York City, where he warned that the city would be diminished until it disappeared as one of the great cities in the world. He deplored the, quote, decline in civility and the expansive dependency of welfare. He wrote in this book, and I quote, and I took the quote out because of my connection at the MTA, he wrote, thus, in the subways, the two worlds of New York collide, the working class that seems normal and the never working world of criminals and the utterly hopeless. When they meet in the subway, it raises the possibility that the entire system will come bit by bit to a stop. So I'm sorry Roger Stone didn't get a chance to see that the things he worried about and the things he wrote about never became a permanent reality. 20 years ago, there was the beginning of a transformation in New York City that helped change New York City and absolutely proved Roger wrong. Instead of stopping or shrinking, the city actually blossomed with unplanned population growth, a reduction in crime and welfare, an increase in jobs, and most importantly, a revitalization of places like the South Bronx and East New York. In fact, as we all know, people are living in places in New York City today because of all of the things that have happened over the last 20 to 30 years, like the reduction in crime and everything else, that we never thought that people would ever be living there again. The policies of the last 20 years, by and large, have made New Yorkers hopeful again. So I'm glad Roger was wrong about the bleak future of New York City. I can understand what he was going through during the fiscal crisis with all of the layoffs and how frustrating it is for a guy who had a lot of expansive ideas. But for me, the future of New York is actually endless, and it won't be without its problems, and it won't be without its hiccups, but the city will grow. As all of you know, the biggest problem for the city has been and will be the availability of affordable housing. The affordability challenge will need to be the focus of the next mayor. City Hall must acknowledge that housing production, either new or renovations, are going to be needed and is not just important for the purpose of expanding the supply of much-needed housing and improving communities. It must be acknowledged as a critical economic development strategy that will create jobs and ensure that our competitive position in our global marketplace. Planners, actually when I wrote this speech, this paragraph was true, but it seems to be changing daily. Planners are uniformly predicting that by 2030, the population of New York will grow by another 1 million people. So there have been some discussion lately with city planners who are saying they may have overshot that number of 1 million. But even if it's 500,000 or 750,000 more people, this is only going to happen if the housing stock in New York, and specifically that we increase the number of available housing units all throughout the 5 boroughs. To maintain New York City's competitive advantage, we're going to need to ensure that we once again lead the world and lead the country in housing innovation. It is imperative that we make the most effective and efficient use of scarce government resources. We must embrace and have to embrace new public-private initiatives. In fact, we need to break down the barriers that prevent effective public-private partnerships in New York City. We need to re-engineer a government approval process that often adds to both the cost of housing construction and renovation and the time it takes to carry out residential housing projects. Housing projects, as I remember, even from when I was financing them in the 80s, take too long from start to finish. Because of my experiences, Marvin discussed it, I have always been a firm believer in using tax policy to induce affordable housing. The crisis faced by Ed Koch in the 1980s was so severe that it mandated direct investment of city dollars through the capital program. I'm not convinced that this level of government involvement is necessary today or in the near future. I do believe, however, that properly structured tax incentive programs will be available and will be needed to provide the encouragement necessary for the private sector to move forward with the development of affordable housing programs. Properly structured incentives will yield the growth in housing stock necessary for the city to grow. I also believe that supportive housing for people with special needs and our aging population need to be expanded and incorporated into more diverse housing developments. We are, gratefully, all living longer, and our housing stock is going to have to reflect that reality. Regarding NYCHA, and I saw that John left, and I think Emily is still here, I think we need to start looking at the Housing Authority a little bit differently and a lot more comprehensively. And I want to look at it from a point of view of not blasting them all the time. There are some ideas that we need to follow up with the folks at NYCHA. We have to start looking at our NYCHA developments and start thinking about them as communities. When they were built 50 and 60 years ago, they were built without any retail stores. They were built without any high quality or any supermarkets whatsoever. I think we need to do that. I think we need to provide these developments with more retail. And the reason why is it's going to provide NYCHA with a steady stream of income to help them with their burgeoning financial problems, but it's also going to change the quality of life for the people who live in these developments. These residents deserve to understand that they too live in a neighborhood. Let's make them neighborhoods. Let's make them communities, and we can do that because that's been one piece that's been missing ever since NYCHA was created. And finally, the communities along our shorelines experienced tremendous devastation on October 29th of last year with Superstorm Sandy. I believe we simply did not plan sufficiently for the events that occurred to ensure that our residential communities can be restored and protected from the realities of Zone A flood areas. The city's going to have to assert new leadership in coordinating the federal, state, and local responses, including the allocation of resources, establishing a robust civic dialogue, and deeper channels of communication. And they're going to need to be a clearinghouse to help residents get the help and information that they need. The next mayor is going to have to reinvigorate the Office of Emergency Management. It needs to be the agency that it was conceived to be, an action agency, not just and merely a planning agency. There was a time when OEM was in charge. There was a time when OEM was an incident commander. This needs to happen again as we move forward into the future. So let me just wrap up by saying thank you to CHPC for the Roger Starr Award. Thank you for educating me on who Roger is. He will be a role model of mine for some time, and I greatly appreciate this award that you've given me. Everybody who is part of CHPC, thank you. Keep up the good work, and look forward to seeing you soon.